This is the California State Senate.
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 Este es el Senado Estatal de California.
This is the California State Senate. This is the California State Senate.
This is the California State Senate.
Esta es el Senado Estatal de California.
This is the California State Senate.
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 Este es el Senado Estatal de California.
This is the California State Senate.
This is the California State Senate.
Welcome to an Internet Town Hall with State Senator Noreen Evans. Tonight's topic, genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. Joining the Senator are Dr. Michael Hansen from the Consumers Union and Becky Spector of the Center for Food Safety. Now, live from Sacramento, here's the moderator for tonight's Town Hall, Brian Green.
Well, hello everyone and welcome. If you ate a bowl of cereal for breakfast this morning, had a soft drink or a packaged snack or fruit at lunch, or had a frozen entree or a fresh vegetable for dinner tonight, if that's what you're going to have, there is a likely chance you ate a genetically modified organism, or a GMO, a food produced from a plant or animal that has been modified or manipulated in a laboratory at a cellular level to make a food product resistant to insects or disease or pesticides and herbicides. Grocery store shelves are full of boxed and bagged foods and produce that have been genetically engineered, and it's been that way for decades. But when you bought or ate that cereal or soft drink or entree, did you know you were likely buying or eating genetically engineered food? Well, that caveat emptor, buyer beware element of the debate over the use and safety and labeling of genetically modified foods is what prompted organic food growers, healthcare experts, and consumer advocates to put on California's ballot in 2012 Proposition 37, which would have made California the first state in the U.S. to require labels on genetically engineered food, clarify what foods could be labeled as natural, and potentially open the door to lawsuits or legal action against growers or retailers who mislabeled their products or misled the public. Well, despite an extraordinary amount of money spent by both the natural food advocates and the big food growers and industry on both sides, and polls at the time showing the public supporting GMO labeling by a wide margin, Prop 37 fell to defeat. But it lit a fire under foodies across the country and galvanized the debate and helped draw sharper battle lines about whether GMO labeling is in the best interests of consumers and families and their health, especially when there's no other labeling regulation around, or if it's unfairly attacking popular and healthy and safe food products that have been around for decades, and it's a mandate with no basis in science. Prop 37 also prompted similar GMO labeling initiatives and legislation in other states. Some of those measures have survived, some have not. And the vacuum in the debate left by the defeat of Prop 37 has also prompted a California state lawmaker this spring to introduce her own legislation, Senate Bill 1381, which has been described as a simpler, cleaner version of Prop 37, depending on which headline you read, and would require genetically modified foods to be labeled as such, and would change the threshold for punishment or awarding of damages in food labeling cases. Well, tonight we are going to talk about the specifics of this bill, the lessons learned and improved upon here in California since Prop 37, and we're going to look at the arguments of the food industry, which believes that this is a non-issue. And we will see if the whole debate moves us any closer to the basic element of this argument, which is choice. Joining us here is State Senator Noreen Evans from the North Coast, the 2nd Senate District, representing the coast and a good part of the wine industry here in California. Right. Senator, welcome. Glad to have you here. She's also the author of Senate Bill 1381. Good to see you again. Also joining us is Dr. Michael Hansen, PhD. He is a senior staff scientist with the Consumers Union, the Policy and Action Division of the Consumer Reports, and also part of Consumers International. And they work to pass consumer protection laws in various states and in Congress. And you have, of course, an expertise in the evolving science of food safety and environmental health. So we welcome you, Doctor. And here from California is Grant Lundberg. He is the CEO of Lundberg Family Farms in Richvale, California, here in the gorgeous Sacramento Valley. 16,000 acres of farmland, a ginormous farm that is out here in the valley. The Lundberg Family Farms is a top grower and marketer of non-GMO rice products in particular, which are available in stores all over the United States and Canada. And Mr. Lundberg's grandparents started the farm in 1937, so a lot of generations there on those acres. And he actually also was a driving force behind Proposition 37 back in 2012. Thank you for joining us, sir. And we're going to look also at some of the industry's concerns and some of their scientists' research and perspective and arguments on this, because if for no other reason, they are not here with us in this broadcast. Senator Evans' office extended an invitation to a representative of an organization representing the Grocery Manufacturers of America, Monsanto, California Grain and Feed Association, the California Seed Association, Coca-Cola, and other related groups. But that representative declined to participate in our program tonight. But we will do our best to keep the conversation fair and balanced, as we say. And a lot of that involves you, the viewer. If you are watching this program and there's any particular questions or comments that you have as we're having this discussion, right below the screen is a place for you to put your name, your location, write in your question or comment, hit send. The key of this is to get to as many emails as we can in the body of the program and as many diverse viewpoints and questions as possible. So feel free to participate. We'll be glad to take your questions. We already have a few lined up. Welcome, folks. Senator, let's talk about it. You, of course, have been right in the middle of all of this for the last couple of years, and it's been 2 years since Prop 37 fell to defeat. But it was actually a close vote, and even with the polls showing support. What happened? If you let you be the prognosticator for the election of 2012.
Perhaps others that were more heavily involved in that campaign.
Well, the proponents lost the battle, but they won the war in a lot of ways.
Yes,
so talk about that.
Well, you know, the initiative went down to defeat by a very narrow margin, and the proponents of the initiative were outspent 7-1. So for every dollar the proponents spent, they were outspent by $7 by the opponents of the bill, excuse me, of the initiative. And polls have shown, though, that Californians want to know what is in their food, and really it's very common sense. I'm a mom. I read every label of everything I ever put on my table. It takes me hours to go grocery shopping sometimes. I want to know what's in the food that I'm feeding my family, and I'm not alone. I think most consumers want to know what's in their food, and if you think about it, you know, human beings, our bodies are made up of groups of cells, right? You're the doctor, you can talk to this better than I can, but common sense dictates we feed ourselves with the food that we eat, and if that food is genetically modified on a cellular level, you have to ask the question, what is that doing to the cells in our bodies? So people want to read the labels. They want to know if there's fat or sugar or whatever's in that food product before they eat it. They also want to know if it contains genetically modified organisms. So my bill is simply a common sense measure, allows consumer choice, and with the failure of Prop 37 to pass, it was much broader, by the way, than my bill. My bill is significantly limited. So with the defeat of that initiative, you know, let's just pass the legislation. And one of the beauties of having legislation is that if it doesn't work or it needs to be tweaked, the legislature can do that. We don't need to go back out to a vote of the people. So it's a common sense measure that will let people know what's in their food.
Well, give us some of the details of your legislation. So it's kinder and gentler, more simplified.
Kinder, gentler,
that's
simpler,
one of the headlines said.
So
you're basically just asking for genetically modified foods to be labeled.
Basically, if it's a packaged food and you're buying it as a consumer, and it includes GMOs, just have a label. And you know, I think 64 countries around the world require this kind of labeling. It's not new, it's not rocket science, it's very simple. And the law would be able to be enforced by the Attorney General's office or by an individual consumer if they were misled and if they were harmed. But it's very limited.
And one of the folks out there had said that what made this initiative, as some of them put it, deeply flawed, was the legal issues, the litigious element of it. You've streamlined that a little bit in your bill, right?
Streamline that,
Explain that.
Yes. Well, the consumer, if the consumer is going to sue, basically they can sue for injunctive relief. They can sue to stop the product from being put on the shelves that's not properly labeled. And they can get their reasonable attorney's fees and costs, and that's determined by a judge. That's it. If they were harmed by ingesting it, they might be able to get recovery for that kind of harm, but you're not going to see big class action suits and this fear of litigious people going around and suing manufacturers. In addition to which, Prop 37 applied liability much broader than this law would. It would apply liability to farmers as well as producers and manufacturers. This bill is much more limited, much more.
But you go beyond just packaged foods, right? You're dealing with environmentally friendly farms, the fisheries, that kind of thing, isn't that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So explain a little bit more on that, just how encompassing this is.
It would apply to meat and fish products and just meat and fish that you put on the table. And it would apply to other packaged foods, rice. It would apply to rice, things like that.
But grocers are held harmless to some degree, and the farmers as well, right?
It's the organization, it's the company that packages and labels the food that would be responsible.
Do you still have a concern about burden of proof? Do you still leave things open for lawsuits, which I know, again, was one of the issues that was out there?
Well, you know, here's the thing, and lawsuits get a bad rap. I understand that. But if we take away the citizens' ability to enforce the law will not be enforced. So basically, we would be passing a law that has no teeth in it. And what's the point of that? So there has to be some way for the consumer to be able to sue to enforce the law. The Attorney General, they're not equipped, nor are they funded to enforce every single law in the state of California every time it's violated. So there has to be some ability for the private consumer to enforce this law. And that's what this does.
Dr. Hansen from the Consumers Union, you've been dealing with this issue, I know, for at least, decades, at least nearly 30 years, testifying on this issue all over the country. You have kind of said in some of your writing that genetic modification, the issue has reached a tipping point. Give me some of your clarification on that.
Well, I think what the issue is that genetic engineering or genetic modification is something that's different than conventional breeding. And there's now global consensus that that's true. Codex Alimentarius, that's the food standards setting organization of the UN. It's jointly run by the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and their standards are functionally written into the World Trade Organization. So the U.S. is part of a global community, and yet our FDA over 20 years ago in 1992, they decided genetic engineering isn't any different than conventional breeding. And in fact, their policy that there was no difference came out of the Council of Competitiveness of the White House. Then Vice President Dan Quayle actually announced it on May 29th, 1992 as a deregulatory initiative. So the problem is we don't require safety assessments. The companies get to do their own testing, and they do these voluntary consultations with the FDA. And since there's global agreement that genetic engineering is different and that there should be required safety assessments, and they've even laid out what kind of assessments those should be, we don't do that here. So part of the reason that you want labeling is because if there are any unintended health consequences, and there's a debate over that, there is evidence from animal studies that there could be health problems, well then you need labeling to be able to track any differences. So that means the only way you can tell if something is causing it is you have to know who's been exposed and who hasn't been exposed. And that's why you have to have positive labeling. Not just looking at people that eat the non-engineered. You have to know who's eating the engineered so that you can track any problem. And that's basically why I think Consumers Union, we've always said new technologies should go through a safety assessment before they're allowed on the market, and labeling should be permitted. And labeling is particularly important because, as I said, the FDA doesn't require that. And so we're sort of on our own.
And we'll talk about some of the state legislatures and the state initiatives, including here in California, that have tried to fill that vacuum. Let's talk real quick to Grant Lundberg, who is the CEO of Lundberg Farms. You have been opposed for a long time to genetically modified food. So much of our crop output, soy, cotton, corn, canola, contains genetically modified crops. I guess for the sake of the answer, because I know where your response is going to be on this, why are farmers so concerned about this?
Well, I think for us, it comes from our history, and for Lundberg Family Farms, the family moved out from Nebraska during the Dust Bowl, came to California, wanted to farm in a way that really took care of the environment and built the soil. And in the 60s, we had some people come to us and say, hey, why don't you raise organic rice? And because of our methods, we could understand what that was. So we started to sell our organic brown rice to consumers. And what we found out was they were really interested in how is it grown? What are you using on this? How do you store it? How do you mill it? And that sense of, listening to the consumer really got us to understand, our consumers have some real concerns about this technology, and we want to give them an ability to make a choice when they're shopping. And so that's really kind of what has got us into this issue.
Well, so many farmers are disagree with the notion of labeling, and in fact, for years, people have said, we want our food, we want it cheap, and farmers have been trying to kind of bow to the needs of the consumers. Something's changed here.
Something's changed. I think the New York Times last summer did a survey, and I think over 92% of the U.S. consumers want to be able to make a choice. The only way they can make a choice is with labeling. And there's a reason in the fall that there was a study done in the retail grocery industry. The non-GMO labeling that's going on right now, that retail market is worth $178 billion. They project that by 2017 to be at about 30% of the retail market. And that's because people want to be able to have the choice. And I think it's such a timely idea for California. I think one of the things in agriculture in California produces over $44 billion worth of agriculture commodities. About 18 billion of those are exported. Many of those markets have labeling requirements. They're one of the 64, like the EU or China or India or Russia. And we present to them from California many different specialty varieties of asparagus, carrots, lettuce. And if we want to be competitive in California agriculture, we need to be able to sell to the markets that demand labeling and want to be able to test. And this initiative will help organize California agriculture to be, I would say, successful in the 21st century. We need to be able to access those markets. Without this, technology moves into the supply chain, there's no differentiation, and we've lost our ability to give consumers choice globally.
I want to get to some of the emails here, and I know particularly with this first email, I think that there are some graphs that we can reference here, Senator, and we can get some response from our guests. Our first question comes from Dave from Inverness, beautiful part of the coast over there. Currently, 64 countries, we've already discussed this, but it begs repeating, around the world require GMO labeling, and that includes most of the developed countries. What's the reason California doesn't require it? And I'll let you start off on this, Senator. What's happened here? Do we just, after 30 years, do we just not care here in California?
Well, no, I think you're seeing the influence of special interests here. Certainly that is what led to the defeat of Prop 37. There's a second chance now with my bill, SB 1381. We'll see, it's getting its first hearing in the Health Committee tomorrow in the Capitol and the Senate, so we'll see where it goes. But you referenced graphs, and I think that those graphs that we're going to see will show that there's quite a lot of public support across every way you want to slice it. Quite a lot of public support for this kind of labeling.
Well, let's take a look at the first one here, dealing with gender, men and women, and the breakdown, if you can see that there, of their support or opposition to this bill, or to the issue, actually, of labeling GMOs. Any comment on that, Doctor, or my farmer friend over there?
Well, surveys actually show, because we've been following them over the years, it's usually between 80 and 95% of people want labeling. But the answer to this question about why California doesn't require it, it really is the special interest. If you look at Prop 37 in California, and then last year I-522 in Washington, in just those 2 years, industry spent $70 million 48 million in California and 22 million in Washington State. And the same thing happened in both. Before they started their campaigns, people were supportive of labeling, and by basically pouring all this money in, they get these narrow wins, 51 to 49. And so it's what's different compared to 10 or 15 years ago is more and more people want labeling, and the industry is having to spend a lot more money to beat back these ballot initiatives.
Well, it sounds like the stats for those that are in favor of the labels seems to be pretty consistent over the last year. So I think the last poll I saw from last summer showed nearly 93%, nearly 100%. Everybody wanting this. So it seems like the conventional wisdom, the conventional argument seems to be on the side of the consumers there. But we have another graph that I think we can look at. This was looking at ethnicity. Let's see, we have whites, Latino, Asian, African American. So there's some interesting disparities from that context. Any comment from my guests?
Still huge majorities. I mean, these are super majorities that support labeling.
And even across political lines, you see it the same way, because if I'm somebody who wants to be able to make a choice, I'm a libertarian, I need to be able to make the choice. I can't make that choice now. Somebody else has made it for me.
Right.
And I think that is important. That individual choice issue brings a lot of people into this, onto this, you know, in support of this.
You know, on that issue, I just want to mention, I have close family members that suffer from autoimmune diseases. I have a dog that gets severe pancreatitis if she eats the wrong thing. I don't think the food industry should be making our choices for us. You know, they shouldn't be allowed to experiment with my family members' health based on what they want to do with GMOs. It's our responsibility as consumers to be able to say, okay, I'm not going to eat that, but we can't make that responsible choice if we don't know. And so this is simply a matter of knowing. It's so common sense.
And there are other, let's say, more inert issues like country of origin. Is the juice from concentrate? You know, has it been irradiated? Those are all things that consumers wanted to know. They wanted to make that choice. That's America. We should be able to have the choice just like the 64 countries in the world. And I think we're missing that.
There was another graph in there, we'll bring it back up. This is dealing with a regional breakdown here in California. Different parts, obviously in the Bay Area, in Southern California, there's definite preference for the GMO labeling. Interesting though, in Sacramento, kind of a disparity. Here we are, the farm to the fork world. There's still quite a few people out there that are questioning this issue. Any particular perspective on what you've seen of California, and particularly you, in terms of what Californians want?
Yeah, well, I would say what California wants is labeling, and we see that. I mean, we see that in the polls, like we've been looking at. And you know, I think the gradation comes in how is that implemented, and that's what I think the bill that the senators put forward is, like she said, it's a simplified, clean version that really helps the market get to labeling. And I think that's what's...
But you know, I think the food movement, if you want to call it that, has really expanded over the last couple of decades. I can remember when I was in law school, I graduated in 1981, I shopped at the original co-op here in Sacramento. It looked very different back then. But people, even back at that time in the early 80s, were beginning to understand, well, you know, what I eat really affects my health. And I want to eat organic, or I want to eat natural, I want to eat local. And that really, over the last 30 years, has really taken off, and I think it's expanded everywhere. And California actually is behind the curve in this. 64 counties, or countries, as we've already said, in other parts of the world have already done this, so we're behind. We really need to catch up.
Isn't this transparency and choice already there? I can go in a grocery store now, and if I want to find organic foods, I can go to the organic foods section. It's already there. What do you say? Why are we going through this extra element of requirement here in California and in other states?
Well, I would say two things. One, since this is a new technology, it should be on the people that want the new technology. Number one, to show that it is safe. And number two, again, the reason you want those labels is to track unexpected health effects. You have to know who's been exposed. So this argument that if people want to avoid GMOs, what the industry says is they can eat organic, or they can go to the non-GMO project and look for labeled things. That's good, but again, that doesn't scientifically doesn't get you with trying to figure out what kind of potential health problems there could be. And I should just point out, I think part of the reason consumers are skeptical about this technology is we were told it was going to help feed the world and do these wonderful things, but when you look at it, it's really about increasing the sales of herbicides. For example, soybeans, 93% of the U.S. acreage is engineered. That's all herbicide tolerant. That means they're designed to be sprayed with glyphosate or Roundup. We look at canola, which you have oil, 94% of that's engineered. It's all herbicide tolerant. Sugar beets, 95% engineered, all herbicide tolerant. Corn, 88% is engineered. About 50% of that is herbicide tolerant. That means it's designed to be used and sprayed with glyphosate. So people are concerned that these herbicides, which we were told at one time were perfectly benign, we now know that glyphosate is not perfectly benign. It has been linked to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and other health problems, and there's been an explosion, over a 10-fold increase in its use since GMOs came on the market, and all they've done is help to create an epidemic of superweeds. So there's other reasons why I think consumers are concerned, not just safety, they have to do with environmental and other reasons as well, and those are parts of choice, and that's what the market should be doing. We supposedly live in a free market, and free markets are based on information.
Right, it's only free to a certain extent, but there's one other thing. On the labeling issue, why should some of these foods be labeled? There are companies that are producing, that are not organic foods, but they're producing non-GMO foods. For example, Chipotle. So why should Chipotle be lumped in with another company that isn't doing non-GMOs? You know, we should be able to make that distinction and figure out as consumers, I want to spend my money here and I don't want to spend it there.
We're going to go back to the emails. Kramer from San Rafael. What are our options for getting this in place, since it seems too difficult to convince the public to vote in favor, given the big money that goes into the opposition's campaigns? Are there other ways to accomplish our labeling goals? Some response on that.
Well, that's why you have laws, because Consumers Union, we have an office on the West Coast here in California, and the West Coast office has actually been very, doesn't like ballot initiatives because they basically say that it all depends on how much money is poured into them. And in this last ballot initiative, Prop 37, we saw all sorts of falsehoods coming out from the pro side. So hopefully with bills, those are able to move more quickly. And even though there have been bills in 27 states for almost 15 or 20 years, in the last couple of years we've actually seen a movement. Last year, both Connecticut and Maine passed mandatory labeling bills. Now, they have triggers and they don't go into effect until a number of other states in the Northeast also label, but those were big wins in both of those states. And in Vermont, a bill passed the House last year, and there's one that is going through the Senate right now. So there really is this, I see this sea change, and there are more and more bills coming up in various states that I think have a good chance of ultimately make it through.
Do we risk a patchwork of legislation and regulation here in this country?
No, that's an argument GMA uses, but some of us have been involved in drafting, whether they're the ballot initiatives or the bills, and they make sure that the language is virtually the same. For example, I make sure that the definition they use of genetic engineering is the same definition that is used globally at Codex, which is functionally written into the World Trade Organization, right? So we're using the definition that everybody around the world agrees upon. And the reason that things are happening at the state level is because we've functionally been told behind the scenes that for the feds to act, it's going to take one state. As soon as one or a few states pass labeling laws that will go into effect, then there will be some kind of movement at the federal level, because ultimately I think we'll have some form of a federal law, because we're already having problems with trade because of our inability to label and also to require safety assessments.
Going back to the emails from, this is anonymous, I believe from Potter Valley. Will animal feeds also be labeled in your legislation?
In my legislation, they are not labeled. I believe they should be labeled. As I said, I have a dog that suffers from acute pancreatitis if she eats the wrong food. So I believe they should, but my bill is not written to include animal feed. It's human feed only.
All right, we're going back to another question here. Eric from McKinleyville. What will the GMO label say? How will it help me make an informed choice as to what food products I should buy? What practical information will the label provide that specifically tells me why I should choose a GMO versus a non-GMO product? Don't organic growers have the option of labeling their products as non-GMO? Why shouldn't this be a voluntary process?
Well, the end of the question goes back to what I said originally. There are companies that produce non-organic, non-GMO foods, and I don't believe they should be disadvantaged. As far as what the label says, my legislation does not specify what the label will say. It simply requires that it be labeled GMO. You could say it contains, it includes, it may contain, or whatever. The legislation doesn't say. But, you know, just knowing that this is a GMO product allows the consumer to make that choice.
All right, if you are just, go ahead. Yes.
Actually, the legislation is pretty clear there front and back, because since I'm a manufacturer, you know, that's the first thing I check into. So it's either front or back that has to say may contain or may partially contain. You've got to label it that way on the front or back of the package. So that's what you included, and I think that's a really reasonable way to handle the issue.
And it's simple.
Yeah.
Okay.
Doesn't require a whole lot of space either.
If you have just joined us, we are talking about the issue of GMO labeling, and our guests are State Senator Noreen Evans of Santa Rosa, representing the Senate, 2nd Senate District. She is the author of SB 1381, and Dr. Michael Hansen, a senior staff scientist with the Consumers Union, and Grant Lundberg, who is the CEO of Lundberg Family Farms in Richvale here in Northern California. And we do want your emails and questions. If you are watching, anything that we're saying prompts you to want to bring up a question based on some of the dialogue or discussion, enter your name, enter your location right below the screen, write in your question or your comment, hit send. We're going to get to as many of the questions from the constituents and the viewers as we can. Dennis from Sebastopol asks, aren't most of our fruits and vegetables genetically modified? Isn't that what Luther Burbank was doing? Isn't that what the nature does over extended periods of time? I'm in favor of an advisory to food producers, but not a law that requires them to incorporate some undefined information on the label. Very good question.
Yes, that's an excellent question, and it will allow me to clear up some misinformation, because I think even scientists who haven't been involved in this debate don't understand this. And this is this term genetically modified. That's the state of the art. That's the term that's used in Europe, and it's defined in their legislation. And what it means is it's forms of manipulating genetic material, whether DNA or RNA, in ways that don't happen naturally. It's identical to genetic engineering. That's why I prefer to use the term genetic engineering. And these are new technologies. So it's not what Luther Burbank has been doing. Luther Burbank was a very famous plant breeder. That is via conventional breeding, via crossing, even wide crosses. That is not what we're talking about here. One of the main ways, for example, that they engineer a material is they take the genes that they want to move, they make what's called a genetic cassette, and then they coat little tiny particles of gold or tungsten, and in a petri dish they literally fire it in and shoot the genetic material in there. And that's a perfect metaphor, because you have no control over where you're inserting things. So the process of engineering can cause all sorts of problems. So this is not something that nature does over extended periods of time. It's something that is new. And for Dennis, this is not undefined information. There's a specific definition of what genetic engineering is, or genetic modification. Again, it's the same language that is used globally through Codex Alimentarius and in the Convention on Biological Diversity, which the U.S. is not a signatory to, but many other countries are. So it's something that is very defined, and it's actually new technology. It is not something that we've been doing for thousands of years. I've heard people say, well, we've been genetically modifying dogs or barley for thousands of years. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about using new technologies And that's what is meant by genetic modification. It's a European term. It's identical to what we would call genetic engineering in the U.S.
The other thing for me that's always helpful is we're bringing together two species that in nature would never combine to make a new plant or a new animal. So that's one of the unknowns in this process.
Well, and actually there's two unknowns. One is, yes, you can take genes from widely different sources, but even if you took genes from the same species, the process of how you're doing it causes all sorts of problems. So it's an issue of the wideness of the crosses, because you can take DNA from bacteria or mice, put it into plants, but it's also the process itself causes all these disruptions. That's often called insertional mutagenesis. So the problem is not just genetic material from different species, different genera, but it's the process itself causes problems.
This is like taking DNA from a fish and inserting it into an apple. Luther Burbank did not do that.
Well, you mentioned fish, a great segue for our next
And the
question.
salmon.
Stacy from Berkeley saying, I'm concerned about genetically engineered salmon. Is the FDA going to approve it? Is it safe? Is the FDA even going to take action on something like this?
Well, this engineered salmon has been sitting in this queue for quite a while. The FDA has said that it's safe and it doesn't raise any environmental issues, but the science behind that is actually very, very bad. The company's own data suggest that there could be an allergy problem, that the allergenicity of the salmon could actually increase, and the environmental testing that they did was actually very, very bad as well. In terms of when it might be approved, we don't know. We don't know. It could be any time.
All right, some specifics about SB 1381 from T. Matthew from Los Angeles. What specific penalties does SB 1381 prescribe for failure to comply with the GMO label requirements? Does Senate Bill 1381 allow members of the general public to sue sellers or manufacturers for damages or injunctive relief? Now, we went through a little bit at the outset, but let's clarify again that you've made this process a little bit simpler and less punitive to folks involved.
And it's a little more, again, streamlined. The bill would allow the Attorney General's office to seek an injunction, or it would allow a private citizen to do the same and to recover reasonable attorney's fees and costs. And it doesn't apply to farmers, it does apply to the manufacturers.
Well, let's talk about the state of this here in California. We have a Chipotle. This is not my lunch. This is just a brand. We're not teasing or plugging products here, but this is a Chipotle meal. I know this is one of the companies that is involved in this. Let's talk a little bit about other companies, other entities and industries in California that are focused on the labeling issue here in this state. Just some comments on that. Chipotle's one. Any others?
Yeah,
Cheerios.
Yeah, well, the Cheerios was a new entry into this idea, and I think it means, that the companies, the large consumer packaged goods companies, are hearing what consumers are saying and driving this. And so I think, Cheerios came out with this play, in a sense, because, there isn't genetically modified oats, but there may be some sugar in there, and so they're going to have to deal with that to clear it up. But I think it's part of a melting of the iceberg, so to speak, that people are getting this, and like I said earlier, that market is growing, and for us to effectively manage that, labeling really helps the supply chain organize to that. And so I think you're seeing things kind of break off. I think you might have some post
well, yes, I have some grape. I feel like Vanna White here, but
exactly.
we have some post grape nuts, and there's actually a label there. I mean, this brings up a good question about the costs of this. Is this costing anymore? And I don't mean this glibly. Is it costing anymore for a company to make this claim? Put this a little digit here on this box. Will it cost them in the future if this were to become law in California?
That's one of the arguments that the industry likes to make, that this will be very costly. But if we look in Europe, when they required labeling there, David Byrne, who is the European Commissioner for Consumer and Protection Protection of Health, DG Sanco, actually 10 years ago pointed out that before their labeling scheme came in, there were all these fears that there would be double-digit inflation in food prices. None of that happened in the European Union. So the places where there have been labeling, you haven't seen these large increases. There actually have been some studies done in Europe and elsewhere that suggest that the cost of labeling is actually very, very small. The kind of labeling that you're talking about doing here literally would be would cost a family only a few dollars a year, so it isn't these large numbers.
Well, and remember the cost too of eating food that is not healthy for you. Right. There's a lot of costs there that aren't involved, aren't factored in here. And I've actually got a list of some of the American companies that make GMO-free products or label them for sales in Europe. Walmart, General Mills, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, Unilever, Kellogg's, Starbucks, and even McDonald's. They already do this. And I would say that the food industry reads the same polls we do. They know that consumers vote with their pocketbook. And I would say they probably know they're fighting a losing battle, because long term, California is going to do this, whether it's with SB 1381, whether if it's with initiative. We're going to do this. It is going to happen. And
you're also seeing this move in the marketplace, because the non-GMO project, you showed their seal, that started in 2010. And by the end of January of this past year, there were over 15,000 food products that are labeled, and the market of those products is now $5.1 billion. So that's actually growing. And last year, when it comes to meat, for example, all labels on meat and meat products have to be approved by USDA. It's the only food where that's true for. Well, the non-GMO project got approval from USDA that they will now be able to put a label on meat and liquid egg products. And if the non-GMO project is on those products, that would be meat from animals that have not been fed engineered grains. And it should be pointed out that this bill does not require those kind of foods to be labeled. And the reason it doesn't is because those animals are not genetically engineered. This is talking about engineered organisms that are in the food supply.
All right, we're going back to the emails. We're talking about the labeling of genetically modified foods. And our guests are State Senator Noreen Evans, Dr. Michael Hansen of Consumers Union, and Grant Lundberg of the Lundberg Family Farms here in Northern California. Jen from Fairfax asks, why have we seen no long-term human health studies for GMOs, even though they have been on the market so long? Are we starting to see more of that?
Well, there's actually, I think, two statements to be made. These foods have only been on the market since 1995, so it hasn't been decades. Second, the reason that there are no long-term safety studies is, one, they weren't required, but more importantly, since these foods and these organisms are patented, that means the company gets control over that. So if you want to do a safety study or anything else, you have to get approval from the company. And that is not the proper way to do science. What I say is, where would we be if the tobacco companies got to decide what kind of research could be done on tobacco or not? That's the case now with GE. So part of the reason we don't have human feeding studies is, frankly, there's no way to do them. Because you would need to know who's exposed and who's not exposed, and for that you need labeling.
And also we want to thank Dan Quayle for that, when he set forth the equivalency that GE product food was the same as non-GE. And that also brought forward the fact that you didn't need to do long-term studies. The government just let it go. And without any consumer dialogue or debate about what does that mean for our food system.
Actually, what they did is, when you look back in '92, when they put out a request for comments, because that's how they do things, publish things in the Federal Register. They got 5,000 comments, which was a huge amount back then. That caused them in '93 to actually come out, and they asked for comments on labeling. And they said what they were going to do is take all these comments on labeling, then they were going to hold a meeting to talk about consumer labeling, and then they would make a decision. None of that ever happened. So the agency sort of fell down. And I should point out that they tried to go globally and get the U.S. system to be accepted internationally. That's what the whole 8-year fight at Codex was. and the U.S. way didn't win out. Actually, good science won out, and there was an agreement that these foods are different. There should be required safety assessments. So the U.S. is really the odd person out. And there was also an 18-year fight at the Codex Committee on Food Labeling, and now Codex has said, yes, countries can label. So the argument that the U.S. has always tried to use is there's no reason to a label, and that these labels would be false and misleading because they would imply a difference when there is none. That's been shown not to be true, and there's been global agreement that labeling is actually permitted. Now we just need to get the U.S. to come into the global community, because 64 other countries require labeling.
We're trying to catch up with the rest of the world.
Well, we're trying to do that, it sounds like, here in California. And Kathy from Tracy asks, can you describe this for the senator, what you are up against in getting this legislation passed? You have other senators who support this bill, and I don't know if this will be just a revisit of the debate and the controversies from the proposition, but I guess you have 4 committees, this bill, 3 or 4 committees that you have to...
It's very, very rare that a bill will get referred to more than 2 committees in any house, and this bill has been referred to 3 committees in the Senate. So, you know, it's... unfortunately, my own party, the Democrats, may kill the bill, but as I said, it's going to pass at some point.
But it's good to have the vetting, right?
Certainly in the debate, and that's one of the reasons why I chose to bring this bill forward this year. This debate has got to continue, and we've got to continue educating people. One of the things we're up against here is misinformation and scare tactics from the food industry. And information and education is critically important. I do have 4 co-authors, Assembly members Yamada and Levine, and Senators DeSaulnier and Pavley. So we already have support. We'll go to our first committee tomorrow in health, and we'll see.
All right. Next question. This actually could be answered, I think, by Mr. Lundberg. Norma from Woodland here in Northern California. GMOs are FDA approved and a huge factor in ensuring a safe and consistent food supply. Why do you oppose science at a significant cost risk to California farmers?
Another
good question.
Example of misinformation.
But that's a good question, because for so long this has been such a key element, allowing farmers to have their crops survive.
Well, I think for farmers it actually jeopardizes their ability to be successful for the reasons we've talked about earlier. With so much of California's production being exported into markets that have labeling or are doing testing, if there is a broccoli that is introduced or a lettuce and it contaminates other lettuce that may be going to the EU or in another product, and they test positive, that market will close to California agriculture. And the California agriculture doesn't have a way to deal with that. It will deal with it when labeling is required. And I think that's for the good of all farmers, to be able to develop the value of their goods in the market.
And I should also point out that that question was actually not correct. The FDA has not made a conclusion on the safety of any of these products. For the Flavor Saver tomato, for the first one, they did, because Calgene, which is located here in California, asked the FDA to treat it like a food additive. Ever since then, the FDA has not made a conclusion about the safety of any of these foods. So people that say that the FDA has said this, that is not true. The letters that the FDA sends to the company, they're all up on the FDA's website. And there's a key sentence that is in all the letters, the one that was sent to Monsanto in 1986 about their first product. I can recite that sentence from memory, and that sentence is, this is the FDA speaking, quote, "It is our understanding that Monsanto has concluded that corn, grain, and forage from Mon 810 do not differ in composition, utility, or use from corn, grain, and forage currently on the market, and do not raise issues that would require pre-market review or approval by FDA." So questioners that think that the FDA has actually made a conclusion about these products, that's not true. The FDA has not, and the reason they don't is their lawyers are very sharp, and they know that if the FDA had said these things are safe and then some problem happens down the road, people get sick, that would mean the companies could have some form of liability. Since the FDA has made no conclusion, if anything goes wrong, the companies will be liable.
There's also a misguided belief that there have been scientific studies on these products and that they don't show any adverse health effects. And that also is not true. And again, since these products have only been out there since 1995, that means humans have been ingesting these for less than 20 years. That's not long term. 20 years is not long enough to determine, even if somebody was studying it, whether or not there's long-term impacts. But on the other hand, we know we're having an explosion of obesity, an explosion of autoimmune diseases. We have any number of health issues that, you know, public health officers are scratching their heads saying, why do we have so much obesity? Well, you know, there could be a connection between what you eat and what you have.
All right, we're getting perspective from the state legislature, from the science lab, and from the field on this issue. And we're going to hear from Erica from Napa, who asks who is responsible for labeling fresh produce sold in grocery stores and farmers markets.
That would be the seller.
The processor in this bill has to understand where the supplies come from. And so I think there is a squash that is genetically engineered. And if I think that processor has to let the retailer know that this may contain, and the retailer will need to make a post.
But in terms of fresh fruits and produce, there really isn't much. There is this squash, there is a papaya, but other things that there had been tomatoes that were developed, those are no longer on the market. There were potatoes, those are no longer on the market.
Correct.
So in terms of fresh fruit and produce, you really don't have, you basically have just the papaya and the squash. Now there's an apple that they want to get approved that's a non-browning, even though the apple industry doesn't want that. And the whole reason for that is so that a McDonald's or Burger King can sell cut up apples and they don't go brown. That's functionally what the market for that thing is, but nobody really wants it. So in terms of fresh fruits and produce, we don't have much. Well, there has been approved, but it's not out there very much. There's also some sweet corn that's engineered.
But I think what Dr. Hansen is saying is mainly it's those products that contain corn, soy, sugar, those canola oil, the processed foods. Those are the ones that are going to have to understand, the processors, we're going to have to understand our supply chain so that we can meet the laws requirements.
And I just have to say, as a consumer and a mother, an apple that doesn't go brown terrifies me. It does. I mean, it's so unnatural. You really want to feed your child an apple that doesn't go brown? If you want to, more power to you, but you ought to be able to know.
Okay, choice is the issue here. Julia from Garberville, she says, this is for the senator, I'm open to the idea of labeling, and I'm always a fan of consumer choice, but why does it have to be government regulated and enforced? Couldn't it be voluntary and self-defining, like kosher or halal or ital standards and labeling? Is there enough of a legitimate public health concern to warrant government involvement at this point? And this is a question that comes up on a lot of these issues. Why does government have to be involved? Because I know the industry is trying to do their own. They've established their own organization for sort of self-enforcement. So what's your answer to that question?
Well, you know, if we could rely on that kind of self-enforcement, that would be one thing. But the food industry is pretty vast, pretty large. An individual consumer has very little power compared to the size of the food industry. I just don't think that we are able at this point to rely on a food industry that has shown itself willing to spend millions of dollars to defeat initiatives where consumers would be able to find out what's in their food. I mean, I don't think that level of trust is there, unfortunately. It is, unfortunately, a fact of life that government, on behalf of the people, sometimes has to put regulation in place. If we didn't do that, you'd still have lead in your paint in your house. If we didn't do that, who knows what would be in your drinking water.
We wouldn't know how much fat was in a product or calories or carbohydrates. We couldn't make a good choice when we went to the grocery store.
Well, you mentioned the apples not turning brown and some of the other elements of this that we've been discussing for this program. And not to sound glib again about this, is there anything good that we can say about genetic modification? Because there's some that say you're giving this a bad rap, that you're turning this into a Franken-food thing that everybody eats every day.
One of the things in the free market, a free market has a way to value things by labeling. So when iPhone comes out with a new phone, when Apple, they state the benefits of it, and you can clearly go purchase that, and that tells them, that tells Apple that's valuable. The consumer likes that. There isn't that loop in this process about what we eat. The companies that are producing this kind of material have no way to get feedback. The only way they get feedback is farmers buy more chemicals. That's it. And the technology may be beneficial, but there's no way to optimize it. We don't know. We can't make a choice. We can't tell them, I don't like that. I'm not going to purchase your product. And so the technology actually has no way to actually be successful. It's just the people who own it who put it out and tell the growers use it. That's it.
Our question here, one of our final questions, comes from Beth from Napa. She says, what are the 3 most important actions that someone who wants to see this bill passed can take to help it succeed? Please list in order of importance. Thank you. Thanks for that question, Beth. So, Senator, you've got a consumer advocate there. What would you suggest people do in order of importance?
In order of importance, the very first thing to do is contact your legislator and do it now, because as I said, this bill is being heard in the Health Committee in the Senate tomorrow. It is being debated in the Capitol right now. So call your legislator, get on the website sen.ca.gov and find your legislator and send them an email or make a phone call. The other thing to remember is there's 2 more things. If this bill doesn't pass, somebody else in some future legislature is going to do it again. So stay on it. Make sure your legislators, even though they're termed out, keep telling them what you think. And then the third thing is vote with your wallet. You know, spend the money where you think it does the most good. Make sure that manufacturers and people in the food industry understand that you want GMO labeling by where you spend your dollars. And if you're grocery shopping somewhere at Safeway or wherever and you can't tell whether that product has GMOs, ask the manager. Make sure the manager at the place you're shopping knows that you are interested in GMO labeling, because that's the only way I think we're going to be able to get this done.
Some other thoughts from the other side of this, and my question sounds so simplistic compared to some of the technology of science and agriculture, but there's the concern that this actually can be good for the environment, that it can be good for the economy. We're talking about jobs in the farmers and in the industry. What's your response to some of those legitimate concerns from science and from agriculture?
Yeah, well, I think I've talked a little bit about that this actually builds opportunity for California agriculture by organizing to address over 60 countries, and most of those are the top markets for California agriculture. It's where we export our products. And so those are closed markets if we have contamination. And so I think that's the opportunity here. It protects and builds the markets.
Okay. And if California doesn't do this, we're going to become increasingly isolated, because the rest of the world already is doing that. So we're going to start losing jobs in the farm industry here locally because we can't sell our food outside of our own borders.
Yeah, and I'd point out that this notion that genetic engineering is going to create jobs when the markets don't want this. I mean, a perfect example with this contamination is there was a rice that was experimentally planted, was never commercialized, and because the U.S. government didn't require any testing to be able to see whether it was contaminating things, it ended up in 2006, LL601, ended up contaminating half of long-grain rice exports. That cost over $1 billion. There were thousands of rice farmers that sued the Riceland and Bayer, which produced it. Bayer, in court, their arguments were, they said this was an act of God and couldn't be foreseen, and they tried to blame the farmers. The farmers who didn't even know they were planning this. It created havoc, and then what happened? At the end of 2011, they quietly settled for $750 million. And in fact, contamination of these engineered products is already causing us trade problems. For example, right now, China will not accept corn coming from the U.S. Why? Because there's this Syngenta Viptera corn, which is engineered with a vegetative insecticidal protein. The Chinese haven't actually approved that yet, and since we haven't approved it for safety or kept it separate, the Chinese are now blocking corn exports, and there's not much the U.S. can do. They can't say that this is a non-tariff trade barrier, because the Chinese are being consistent with the World Trade Organization. That's why last Thursday and Friday in Rome, there was actually a global meeting on this problem of trade disruptions caused by GM contamination. And the U.S. and Canada, which are the main countries responsible for this contamination, they were trying to get other countries to sort of say, well, maybe you should accept this. And there wasn't much agreement on that at all. So I would argue that in this present market, moving forward on genetic engineering actually might decrease jobs and not really increase them.
Is there any element of this debate, Mr. Lundberg, that can help you as a farmer in terms of the products that are used for the crops with pesticides, herbicides, anything that can help you with the product that you're growing? I mean, for example, rice is one of your key elements. I read somewhere that brown rice syrup there's a natural element of arsenic in there. Is there something that can be done in this world of GMOs and these products that could help you with that kind of
I don't
an issue?
know. That's a good question. And I think, we need to be open to explore what science can deliver, but we need to do it in a way that values what the social impact is, what the environmental impact is. And if we don't do that, we're not going to make a good choice. And so I think that's what this bill helps us get, is the choice factor and bring everything into balance. Just not about producing, let's say, they say cheaper food. I would argue that's the only benefit that is talked about. There's not nutritional benefit. There's not dietary benefit.
Aren't we helping other people in underdeveloped countries, for example? I'm just throwing that out
there. I mean, people aren't hungry because there's not enough food. California has millions of hungry people. It has nothing to do with food. It's power and money. That's it. And that goes across the world. So
well, we will wrap this up, but I'm going to sort of put a positive spin on it here as we come to the rise of the hour. Just really the argument about this itself is valid and healthy, that it can just perhaps even help heal the rift of misunderstanding between the food producers and the consumers. So no matter where your opinion is, where you lie on the issue of food labeling, GMO food labeling, just the discussion is an education for a state that up until recently hasn't cared too much about this in a larger picture. Do you agree with that? And with that, I'll get your comments and maybe some parting shots here.
Yeah, and I think I said earlier, I think just having the debate is critical, and being able to correct some misinformation out there. And at the end of this whole thing, the food producers and the food consumers really should be in this together. Farmers want to grow what people want to eat. People want to eat healthy food. People are looking now, where is my food produced? What is in it? Who made it? Was it sustainable? People are looking at this much more now. And then the health issues that I think we're experiencing, in part probably because of what we're consuming. These are all things that I think the food industry is going to have to come to grips with, because not only is the rest of the world leading the way, but I think California consumers are wanting to go in the same direction. And so the food industry is going to have to be part of that.
Any final comments, Doctor?
Well, I just say that I think science is actually very important in agriculture. I think the way science needs to move is in a more actually agroecological fashion. That's where you understand how your agricultural systems work, and you design them in such a way to minimize the need for all these inputs, these pesticides and other things. So this isn't about being against science. And I would even point out the problem is really with genetic engineering. There are other forms of biotechnology, such as marker-assisted breeding, which actually have proven very useful. It's this form of the technology that's actually problematic. So people that say this is just an anti-science attitude, no, it's not. In fact, we need more science. We need things like marker-assisted breeding. Agroecological approaches are actually knowledge intensive, because you have to understand how the system works and design it in such a way so you don't need sprays. That's why in the grapes in California now, 25% are organic, and that's because they've devised ways of planting so you have healthy soil, so you don't need to be spraying all these chemicals. That's knowledge intensive, and that's actually, I think, where the future is.
And just some final thoughts, Mr. Lundberg?
Well, just again, 92% of Americans want labeling, and a super majority of Californians want labeling. And we need to give them that opportunity to make a good choice at the grocery store. And I think that's what this bill is about.
Thank you, three of you, for your comments, the technical issues, laying this out for us as best as possible. Senator, we wish you luck with your bill as you move through the process. And thank you again for the education that you've given us on this issue. I know we've only hit just to a little bit of this, just to the surface. There's so much more, and we'll see how this plays out over the next year or so here in California. So that wraps our discussion with State Senator Noreen Evans of Santa Rosa, Dr. Michael Hansen from Consumers Union, and Grant Lundberg, the CEO of Lundberg Family Farms here in Northern California. California. And I want to remind you folks that this program will be archived right here on this page on this website. If you want to go back and review any of the issues that were discussed, or tell your friends and folks to watch, because certainly a fascinating and challenging debate. We encourage you to do so. It'll be archived right here on this website. In the meantime, that wraps up our program and our discussion from the state capitol here in Sacramento. I'm Brian Green. Thanks for watching.